Welcome back to PM Express. We're discussing the nomination of Mr. Kwesi Arthur, Central Bank of Ghana governor, who has been nominated as the vice presidential nominee, awaiting approval from Parliament. Mr. Pratt, before we went on the break, you had some issues to raise about some of the things we were talking about.
Well, there are all kinds of assumptions which are being made, which, in fact, when they are put to the test, will collapse. And there's one assumption which is being made in all the discussions, and which is simply that the current president has nominated his running mate. And that is why there's this comparison between Bawumia and
but it makes sense that we have a very short period to go to elections.
He hasn't nominated his running mate. What he's doing is applying the constitutional provisions and so on, and nominating somebody to serve as vice president up to January 7th, 2013. You understand? Because if you look at the NDC constitution, the choice of a running mate is done in consultation with the Council of Elders of the party.
National Executive
You understand?
Committee.
And it can only be done by one who is already a candidate. Our president now is not confirmed as the candidate. That is to be done in September.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have the authority to choose a running mate. You understand?
Yeah.
So he has not chosen a running mate. That's an assumption. Now, again, there's another assumption that the processes that Parliament would use in approving the nominee would basically be the same as the processes which have been used to approve members of the Council of State, for example, and ministers and so on. I disagree.
What difference will there be?
Parliament may decide to use those processes or may decide to go for enhanced processes and so on. Parliament has to make a decision, because Parliament is faced with a situation which has no precedent.
Yes.
And it's important to recognize that.
Right. So, Prof, I'll come back to you. I was asking about the constitutional provisions of Article 60. Seeing that there is no cap on how long the president has to wait in order to nominate, and so since he became president, we haven't had a vice president. Is this normal, and should we be thinking about reviewing these aspects of the Constitution?
Well, the absence of a time frame is not necessarily unusual. When you make a nomination subject to the approval of Parliament, to the extent that Parliament's approval also means the power to disapprove, it is difficult to command that Parliament do the approval or not do the approval within a certain period of time. So the fact that you have it that way, if it was just the president appointing, then you could constrain that appointment, right? If it was just a unilateral appointment by the president, you could constrain it within some time frame a lot easier than you could when you subject it to the approval of Parliament, when you make that other requirement. So it is not unusual. Actually, 1 week, which is how long it's taken, 1 week is actually for a precedent-setting moment such as this. I think one week is beautiful. It's exceptional. For example, in the U.S., I think that when Spiro Agnew's position as vice president became available and it became vacant upon his resignation, it took Nixon 3 days to replace, to nominate Gerald Ford for the position. When Gerald Ford's own position as vice president became vacant upon Nixon's resignation and therefore his ascendancy to the presidency, it took him about 11 days to nominate. So it took him more than a week, right? There isn't any set time. And in both cases, in Ford's case as vice president, it took the Congress, 2 houses of Congress must approve in the U.S., took them roughly 2 to 3 months to approve. In the case of Rockefeller becoming vice president, it took them actually from August to December to approve, because there was an extensive investigation of Rockefeller before the confirmation hearings took place. So I think that for this precedent-setting moment we're in, 1 week to make the nomination is fairly reasonable. Whether or not we did a constitutional amendment to constrain it further, obviously the absence of a time limit does not necessarily mean that the president could take forever. right? In the absence of a time limit.
But where do you draw a reasonable timeline?
Exactly. You would have to do it within a reasonable time. And of course, there are also political calculations that go. If you take an unreasonable amount of time, you actually do yourself in politically, coming across as indecisive, as not in control, and the like. So there are political constraints, even though there may not be clear constitutional constraints on the position. And if we want to solve it at all, I think that we can do it legislatively. We don't need to do a constitutional amendment to this, because this is only a gap in the Constitution, if at all. And that gap can be filled by Parliament, because Parliament does have residual powers to fill whatever gaps in the Constitution it wants to fill under Article 298. So we don't really just go through an elaborate constitutional amendment procedure if indeed we think that this has to be constrained within some time. But this precedent having been set, this being the first time, it begins a tradition. And I think that then in future, if this were to happen again, we would measure the future experience against this one.
So what happens in the event that the vetting processes drag unnecessarily?
Well,
which is very likely.
It is likely.
Parliamentary vetting procedures are not straightforward.
It is indeed likely. It's Parliament controls its calendar, and it is indeed likely that it could drag. Like I said, in other countries, these have been known sometimes to drag because they may well come up against some skeletons in the closet. Nobody knows what they're going to find. It's not just a simple process of checking the box and looking at the Constitution and saying you are a citizen of Ghana by birth, you have never committed a crime, and that kind of stuff. I mean, there is a lot more to the due diligence than just checking the box on these 3 or 4 items. So, in fact, it may drag, but that is for Parliament to decide.
For Parliament to decide. Now, Mr. Pratt, I'll ask you one final question before we go. Seeing that we have a short period to go to the elections, and that President Mahama has to present his vice presidential nominee to the Electoral Commission 3 months before elections, do you think Emisa Arthur is likely to be the choice of vice presidential candidate for Mr. Mahama when he goes to Congress?
Well, unfortunately, I think you're asking me to be a soothsayer. I'm not. You understand? I'm not. This is the business of soothsayers and prophets. I'm not any of them. You understand? I think the important question is the question which Prof has attempted to answer, which is whether or not we should set a time frame for the nomination approval of the person.
You wouldn't subscribe setting a time frame, would you?
I think eventually we'll have to come to that, eventually, because you cannot leave it to the pleasure of a president. There's business to be done, you know. There's a lot of work to be done. And if the Constitution says that we must have a vice president, we ought to respect the Constitution. And if you don't have a time constraint on the president, then he can take forever. Then he may decide not to do it until December, in which case that, the whole constitutional provision will be meaningless.
Yeah.
So, in future, at some point, we may have to have some time constraints on the president and even possibly on Parliament itself.
And so you wouldn't attempt to answer the question about whether you think that Mr. Mahama is likely to nominate Emisa Arthur?
Unfortunately, in this case, I can't think.
But would you think that will be fair?
In this case, I can't think, and it's not about thinking anyway.
You can speculate and look at the political cost of changing the ticket.
No, there's no cost at all.
So, Prof, do you think there will be enormous cost to change the ticket?
There's no cost at all. Let me explain that. Right now, he's the President of the Republic of Ghana. The Constitution is mandatory that he should choose somebody to fill a certain position.
And which he has
done. He is not required to go through the Council of Elders of his party. You know, the consultations that he has to make and so on, in terms of the prescription, are limited. You understand? It's between him and Parliament. That's what the Constitution says. If he has to choose his running mate, then first he has to become candidate. He can only become candidate in September. And between now and September, there are many, many imponderables which may occur. You understand? Now, when he has chosen who he thinks will be his running mate, it is subject to
approval from the National Executive Committee and the Council
of Elders. And then eventually National Council of Elders and so on. That's a different ballgame. So he himself may even want, Pakwesi and Mr. Arthur to continue, But there may be constraints as well.
Prof, do you think John Mahama may want Pakwesi Emisata to continue?
I think we can get technical and legalistic about this, but it's obvious that the choice of Pakwesi Emisata was not made just for this 5 months.
5 months.
In the tenure of the presidency. I mean, especially when you factor in all of the constraints that were supposed to have gone into this decision, ethno-regional constraints and all of that. This wasn't a decision that was made only for the duration of the term of this presidency.
So you foresee that Emisata would definitely be chosen by John Mahama?
It would be almost politically suicidal and naive, I mean, and would signal a certain, I mean, what it would signal to the electorate would not be proper. I mean, it would be such confusion to certain segments of the electorate to actually change the ticket.
But why? I mean, why?
Exactly. Signals to the electorate.
Why would it send conflicting signals?
The Constitution requires.
Yeah, that's legally. So we're talking
but I'm going to ignore legality in this matter.
The Constitution is not being breached
exactly.
at all.
But what is happening is a purely legal and constitutional matter.
On the one hand, yes. On the one hand, it is not pure. It's also
he cannot act
That's right.
against the prescriptions of the Constitution.
Which Constitution are you talking about? His
the 1992 Constitution.
Sure.
And he can also not act against prescriptions of his party Constitution. So he's constrained by the Constitution.
Yeah,
he's constrained by law. And if we believe in the rule of law...
He's constrained by what law?
The Constitution has the effect of law.
He has fulfilled that already.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. What the Constitution requires him to do...
The Constitution doesn't constrain him in terms of not choosing Emisata on the ticket. I mean,
no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the Constitution restricts him to nominating somebody to serve out the unfinished term.
Sure.
That is what the Constitution restricts him to do. Now, you can speculate and say that, look, in his own mind, he may want to extend that, to have the person to become his running mate. But that is speculation.
Yeah, but we're not making speculation.
That is speculation.
We're making
we're looking at reality on the ground, really.
What is the reality?
The reality is that we have a short time to elections.
Absolutely.
He has to present a vice presidential nominee to the Electoral Commission 3 months before election.
How are you able... Do you even know who constitutes the Council of Elders of the NDC? You don't.
I wouldn't know.
So you would not even be able to read their minds.
Except that,
you understand?
If you look at
if you are in a position to read their minds, then you could say that, well, I know X, Y, Z, and I know that based on how they think and so on, when the appropriate time comes, they would approve the
but by your
standard,
we can't make any political assessment of anything at all.
No, you can engage in speculation, but present speculation as speculation.
But it can be informed. There's a difference between just speculating in thin air and making informed judgments based on
whether it is informed speculation or not, it is in the realm of speculation. And you should present it as speculation.
But it doesn't...
You cannot present speculation as fact.
Look, the fact is the president, for the time being, under the Constitution, doesn't seem to have a time frame that bound him, right? He could have taken until September
to make this choice.
Absolutely. The fact that he's making it now, right? You can read certain things into it. He's making it now to give himself and his vice president, who I think would be his candidate.
Well, PM Express is getting very interesting, and I'll take.
I mean, we can make those kinds of judgments based on what we know.
I'll take a couple of your messages, which is pouring in, and then we will continue the discussion briefly, and then we go away. I have a message from Isaac Osebonsu who says, "I hope this man is strong enough to absorb Ghanaians' criticism, and anyway, I don't really cherish the comparison of Emisa Arthur to Baumia, because practical application of knowledge is not solely based on one's credentials alone." This is from Erasmus Darko. And then Ibrahim Aziz says, "Elections in Ghana are not won in economics. We have more illiterates than literates. NDC, we have lost it. Why all this Ahoy brothers?" And then Richard Kofi Bwampong also writes that if the president thinks he's the best man to help him complete the last lap, let's give him the respect for doing that in the 5 months available. I want you to educate me if the passing of the late president was on December 7th. What will happen to this presidential candidate? And Entry Emmanuel says it's not a good choice for the NDC. 2012 elections is at stake. And who is Emisa